A quick reminder, each episode could contain some game spoilers, so please listen or watch with discretion. And now, your hosts for the Gamer's Advocate, AMKomnenos, Banana and Legion. Enjoy the show.
I couldn't agree more. Hold on. I see where you're coming from, but I think I'm going to have to ask you to develop that a little bit further.
Oh, that one hurt. It's too real.
Wow. Legion. You've really found yourself in a predicament. Wow. Shut up. Wow. Banana. You've really found yourself in a predicament.
I mean, I don't even know if you need to record next weekend.
Well, welcome to a very special edition of the Gamer's Advocate podcast. We are joined with Banana. And that's it.
And only Banana.
And only Banana. Well, Com will be joining us for another podcast very shortly, but
Not going to go into details, but Com is no longer welcome on this one episode.
Com has played the game that we're going to be going over. However, he just was just as fine saying, hey, look, you guys go ahead and cover it, and we'll move on from that point. He is in the middle of playing the sequel to this game, but we're going to go over Baldur's Gate, and Baldur's Gate 1 specifically. We could tie in some stuff to 2 if we need to, but Baldur's Gate 3 came out very recently, and to give some relevance of why Baldur's Gate 3 and Baldur's Gate 1 are really important to the RPG genre, I think it's really important actually to go over Baldur's Gate 1 again and say what made it relevant enough to necessitate a Baldur's Gate 3. I guess that's where I'm going with that. But as far as when it first came out, it came out in December of 1998, and I just looked that up just to confirm to make sure, and I was pretty sure it was December of 98 because my oldest was born January of 99. So where I had worked, I had some paternity leave, so I didn't get to play it until February because he was born at the end of January. So after, we got him home and everything, I was doing nothing but watching a sleeping child. So I got to play Baldur's Gate that whole time. It wasn't a game that I was anticipating on playing. It wasn't like today where all this fanfare was coming, like Baldur's Gate 3 is coming out. It wasn't in early access for 2-3 years or anything like that. It was just a game I picked up off the shelf because I needed something to do. And it really hit all the boxes that I was looking for. It was a PC game. It was had some class things going on with D&D that I was vaguely familiar with, but the story really is what got me. It was really the box art and everything else had that skull on the front. I mean, it really got my attention from the very beginning. But what is your experience with that, Banana? When did you start playing it?
That's a good question. I want to say I played it a few years after the initial release. I don't know the exact year I got into it. I know that when I started playing it, it was still not a well-known franchise or anything. I also know that Baldur's Gate 2 had already been released. I want to say like maybe 1993, 94 is when I finally
2004?
I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
5 years before it came out. 2003, 2004 is probably when I finally got around to playing it. And it was nothing like any game I had played at that point. Overwhelmingly, my experience with PC games had been educational games or free browser-based or download games. And my experience with console games was very limited. It was mostly Super Nintendo or Nintendo era games. And they didn't really have something that felt as complete as Baldur's Gate did as far as an RPG goes. So Baldur's Gate really stood out for me as my first experience with the kind of D&D oriented game, that using that as kind of the starting point, the framework on which the rest of the game would be built, and such a comprehensive story focused RPG where you really got to make decisions that mattered and feel like you were experiencing a completely different world as a character in that world.
Yeah, BG1 is special. BG2 is even more special, but we're going to limit it to BG1 because you had to start somewhere, obviously. But
Right.
BG1 is very special. They did everything right, in my opinion. I don't know of very many things that they did flat out wrong. They did have to work around some things because not everything in that rule set, can be applied to a PC game. You just can't do it. But I think they did the best with what they had. And without going into deep spoilers, because if you're going to listen to this podcast, we've said it over and over before, there's going to be some spoilers that we just cannot avoid. And if you haven't played this game that's been out since 1998 and you're older than the age of, say, 25, that's on you. I'm sorry. But it's not a game that a lot of people can go into now and say, oh, I'm going to enjoy this because of that isometric view. The rule sets are very different. You have a lot more freedom in modern games now. But if you kind of negate that, just play the story, I think you're in for a world of revelation of what PC gaming and narration can build for you in your mind. Because I have my own channel, and one of the things that I keep referencing is the mind's eye. Because you can have the greatest graphical game out there. There's some great looking games out there, and they play they're wonderful games. I think Starfield looks great graphically. To me, perfect. I prefer that look over, say, No Man's Sky. I love the Wukong game. I love the Tomb Raider games, the more modern ones over the older ones, and as far as how they look, the aesthetics. But when I go back to Baldur's Gate, I see Baldur's Gate. In Baldur's Gate 3, I'm being shown Baldur's Gate. And it's just not a one-to-one. I appreciate everything Larian did in Baldur's Gate 3. I have nothing but good things to say about it. But it's not the way I see it. It's so much dirtier and danker, and there's so much more life in the way I see Baldur's Gate, especially from the original game. So that's just my take on it. But yeah, it's worth a playthrough if you can kind of, I hate saying suffer because you're not suffering playing a game, right?
Yeah.
But it's the isometric view, some of the rule set stuff. But just if you get into it, it's a very easy game to kind of start melting yourself into. Just immerse yourself into it, and it's easy to sink into. It's like a really comfortable bed.
Yeah, I would say if you play on anything above easy or story mode difficulty, it will be suffering through it.
Yeah,
It's a
hard.
challenging game. It's not easy at all. I would say that a core rules playthrough of Baldur's Gate 1 is pretty comparable to an honor mode playthrough of BG3 in terms of difficulty. Maybe not so much the single save element of it, but the challenge is definitely comparable. So if you do want to go back and get the experience, but you don't have the time to invest, or you don't want to master the skills of second edition D&D, completely understandable. I'd highly recommend a story mode playthrough, because the story is the focus anyway. The gameplay was solid, but it's not the reason I love BG1. You can get all of the experiences of why I love BG1 without playing on an elevated difficulty.
And it's an illusion for people who played games back then to say games got easy. No, they didn't. They were just gave you a slider scale. That's the only difference, because the core rule set for us, that's what I always played on. I mean, I was an RTS player playing as a high ranked player. to be able to do a turn-based game, sign me up. it's a relax. So for me, core wasn't so hard. It was just tactical, and it gave me a chance to think about it. No problem. But I totally get it. You're 100% right. The honor mode difficulty level, it would be similar to like the core. So it's not that the games were harder back then. It's just the way it was. I mean,
yeah, and that's exactly it. The honor mode difficulty it requires you to be much more tactical. BG1 required you to be much more tactical than the initial game would present. Because when you just load up with the default settings, you can just walk into combat and it feels like an action RPG with the way that combat just happens. But it's not an action RPG. It is a tactical RPG. You'll need to pause regularly. You'll almost need to create a turn-based system for yourself, because the way the turn-based system in the game works, it's continuous. There's no big stopping points to let you know when it's this person's turn or when it's this other person's turn or when this effect is worn off. It's a very complicated system that feels very rapid unless you are manually taking over and adding your own version of turn-based. That being said, on story mode, it's fine. You don't need to be that tactical.
You're describing basically the real time with pause, and the real time with pause is really what turns people off. But because you think about it logically, like, why do I want to keep stopping a game, pausing and stopping a game? You're really still creating the action. The action doesn't go away because you hit pause. You just pause so that you can navigate the battlefield and almost see it in the because it's happening faster than you're going to be able to react to it. So, for instance, if you have 10 archers in a field shooting at you, in BG3, they're all going to take their turn. Not in Baldur's Gate 1. They could all shoot you at the same time. And you're going to have to, on that round, adjust on that fly based on what you see immediately in that microsecond to microsecond to microsecond, because each thing is turned into rounds, and when the round is over, it just simply allows them to do it. So if you're able to like fire off a arrow once every 2 rounds, then that just means that you're able to fire off another arrow after that round is over. So, but you have to wait that time period, and that's really what that means. But again, you're talking about that individual NPC or enemy or whatever you're talking about. You as the player too are limited in that respect. So you can't just cast fireball and then shoot an arrow immediately thereafter. You have to wait till that round is over. However, there are some actions that you can take that are much faster than others. So if you can get something off, like throw a potion that's within 1 round, and it knocks off half of your archers that were trying to attack you, well, then you've negated half of the battlefield before they even get a chance to get their arrows off. And that's the tactical part of it that makes it really interesting, and you're able to kind of dive into it. And that's all happening, like what took me, 2 minutes to describe happens within 2 seconds.
Yeah.
And that's where the pausing comes from.
Yeah. I can definitely see the appeal moving from RTS games to this real time with pause, because of just the joy of that pause function, to say like, I don't have to react to things limited by my ability to navigate the controls and then process information as quickly as I possibly can. I can pause, study the battlefield, organize my response to what's currently going on, unpause, let it play out a little bit, pause, and then take another evaluation to see what's changed. And I feel like it's funny that I look back at Baldur's Gate 1 and that real time with pause feels clunky. It's not as appealing to me as BG3's turn-based system, whereas the exact opposite is true in other game series where it started out turn-based, and the general kind of consensus among the audience was, I don't like turn-based. Let's make this more continuous. Let's make this more real time. And it still follows that turn-based system, but there's no abrupt pause built into the game. And I'm kind of describing this vaguely, but I am thinking Final Fantasy in my head. Whereas in Final Fantasy, up until 12, I want to say, everything has that hard turn breakup where everything is, you're waiting for this bar to fill. When it fills, it's your turn. Take your action, and then that bar will reset, and you'll get another turn. In 12, and then on in 13, it became a real-time turn-based system where that bar is filling, and you have to also enter in your commands as quickly as you can to make sure you're taking as many turns as you possibly can. And that, I hate that in modern Final Fantasy games. I don't hate it, but I prefer the older system, whereas that is kind of the system that was in BG1, and I prefer the BG3 system for that game.
Yeah. I think it has to do with a lot of the other intangibles. So that's why it's real hard for me to make videos about Baldur's Gate 1, and I expect the crowd that watches those videos knows what I'm talking about. Because I'm not here to give a retrospective. I'm not here to do a review of Baldur's Gate 1, a game from 1998. Is it worth playing in 2024? Guess what my answer is going to be? Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not going to waste your time. It's one of those things
where, like, if it was worth playing in 1998, it's worth playing now.
Yeah. I'm not going to waste your time with my 30-minute analysis of, is it worth playing today? My answer is always going to be yes. I'm going to tell you up front, yes. But let me give you a little bit of details about the game. And you may not find it relevant to you, but I'm always going to say it's worth playing in 2024. And the story in Baldur's Gate 1 is fantastic because you don't start off as the hero. You start off as an individual. All you know is that your parent is necessitating that you leave. Even though you've had all this training in an academic world, you have to leave now. Where you're going, you have no idea. You have no information whatsoever. And you take off into the bigger wide world. And on the surface, you would think that doesn't really lend itself to a great story, but there are so many stories that you are the hero from the very beginning. You're the hero of Kavach. You're going to be the chosen one. We've made a podcast about the chosen one. Mm-hmm. We don't know anything, and things hurt you when you go out into the wild. Arrows in real world hurt, and they hurt you in BG1. Everything is out to get you, and you feel that right away. So that immersion level comes in quick. You have all these sages that are basically tutorial things. If you choose to talk to them, they'll tell you how to play the game, basically. They're almost break immersion because of the things that they say.
Right.
But they're not there saying, do this, and then this will happen. So we're going to tell you how to play the game. You can choose to talk to these guys. And then there's actually an achievement if you talk to all of them. As you probably know, Banana's platinumed everything. Yeah. But I can't tell you how many times I've gone into Candlekeep Inn, and just even the first couple that's by the fireplace, no relevancy to the bigger story whatsoever. But they're creating an immersion within the story, why they're there. Who are you? Their level of class in society, and they're just talking about some other daily stuff. Has nothing to do with the entire game, but it's there, and it builds that world. And that's just the very, very, very beginning, and it does this throughout the whole game.
At once. No time to chit-chat.
A pleasure to meet a socially acceptable person such as yourself.
No time to chit-chat.
My hotel's as clean as an elven arse.
Oh, yeah. The fact that there are people in the world of Baldur's Gate who do not care who you are is tremendous world building that I don't think we saw in other games of that era. Because a lot of people were focused on the narrative surrounding the main character. This is completely understandable. They want to build that narrative. They want to make that the core focus of their game. And everything outside of that feels extraneous. It feels unnecessary for the game that they're making, but it's very necessary for the world that you're building, which BioWare recognized at that time to say, you are someone who exists in Faerun. Faerun exists without you. It will continue to exist. And there are plenty of other people who will continue to exist without you. If we want Faerun to feel real, those people need to be in this game. And they put them in the tutorial. There are people who don't know who you are and don't care immediately. And it sounds it sounds like nothing at all, but it was actually a really good execution of that world building.
And then one of the first people that you meet in another inn very close to there mistakes you for a servant and gives you his pantaloons to go iron. You can choose to take them and keep them, and they turn into something later. But that's kind of like how it is. So they didn't say, here's a quest, here's my golden pantaloons, okay? Or you find them in a drawer. He actually mistakes you for a servant, and you can choose to deceive him, and that way you take them. But why would you take these? Well, you know, again, me, the collector in an RPG, knows red flag. I'll just keep them just in case. And they, like I said, they do turn into something later, but they could have done that a myriad of different ways, but they integrated into the type of world that you're in. So you have this person who's a businessman who is traveling. He doesn't know anybody from anybody. So it's natural for him to mistake you for.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that experience is so real. I think we all, maybe not all, but overwhelmingly, we have some similar experience where somebody has walked up to us and said, like, do you work here? Or something along those lines. Or, to the degree that this guy did, just assumed that we worked wherever we were and started telling us something that we had no concerns about. So I think that was, and that's what world building should be. It should make these people feel real. It should make these interactions feel like things you've already experienced.
Yeah, and so like if you're in, say, I don't know, this is a bad example, but let's say Baldur's Gate 3, and you're armored up to the nines, and you go into that same place, they're not going to mistake you for a peasant, right? But in Baldur's Gate 1, you got to remember, you're going to be like level 1, 2, maybe, because it's a grind. You might be level 2 at that point. And in which case, your armor is not going to look great.
Oh, yeah.
So it makes sense that he would mistake you for just anybody else, because you probably look worse than everybody else. You know?
Yeah, and with the way that game is set up, that's like the only guidance you have at that point is go to this other inn. So you probably head there pretty quickly.
Damn.
Unless you're the type to just go exploring, in which case you'll probably die because there's some pretty challenging stuff around there.
Yeah.
You'll probably head right to that inn. You'll, if you're lucky, survive getting into the inn. And then you'll probably look around to see what's going on other floors, and you'll meet him. So you'll probably be with the same starting equipment, which is nothing impressive. Nothing that's going to identify you as some legendary hero.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense in the game.
You often get to that other inn, usually at night, just the way it kind of works. And what's really neat is that they have a little glow coming from the castle, basically. It's like a big castle, but it's an inn. And you can hear the music very subtly. And that's not something you see, like, even in Baldur's Gate 3. Like, you'll hear music on the street. You'll hear fanfare around you. But if you're outside of, say, the Blushing Mermaid, you're not going to hear music coming out of that, even if there was musicians in there playing. that's just not how they made the game. They just more or less made it to the immediate pocket of where you're at so that you get the immersion right then and there with your immediate. But Baldur's Gate 1 does it a little differently. It's taking ambient sounds from everywhere. It's taking a screeching eagle when you're in the wilderness. It's taking like waterfalls if you're near a waterfall, and it gets louder as you get closer to it. It is an audio experience that really had to work, because you got to remember, they're not working with the best graphics.
Yep.
They have to immerse you in different
that's
ways.
Very much the immersion is a lot of sound bites. And I mean, you talked about it. You get to, typically you'll end up at Friendly Arm Inn at night. You get different ambient sounds at night than you do in daytime.
The
Just
music
makes
changes.
Nighttime feel more real.
Yeah, the music changes too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's such a visceral experience for me sometimes. When I go back in and play that game, I'm like, ooh, this is cozy. This is nice. And yeah, I played hundreds of games. I mean, I'm not, you have too, but I always come back to Baldur's Gate and it just feels different. It just feels different. Been great to watch how that story has been able to stay relevant. Because even with Baldur's Gate 3, you can play Baldur's Gate 3 and never play Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And I've told people that from day one. I've played early access from day one, Baldur's Gate 3. I didn't know exactly where they were going with it because, they hadn't released chapters 2 and 3.
Right.
But I had an idea. There was enough clues there. But what I would say is that Baldur's Gate 1, if you play it all the way through, and then 2, you'll find so many linking ties, and you'll come to a very strong opinion of where Baldur's Gate 3 really, really is going. And you'll have, I guess, more of an appreciation. But you definitely don't have to play 1 and 2. I would just strongly encourage, play the story, get immersed into it, follow it through, try maybe even alternate endings, and then you might be surprised at how much harder Baldur's Gate 3 even hits, even for people that love Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of ties back to our conversation we talked about, I believe in our lore episode, with the idea of these kind of Easter eggs being embedded into games if you want to go and investigate for yourself and learn more about the world that you're playing through. And if you have the luxury of playing through Baldur's Gate 1 and Baldur's Gate 2, and then going back to Baldur's Gate 3, which I feel like that's going to be the experience for most people now. There are those of us who played through the series in order, probably among the minority at this point.
Extinct.
But if you do get the opportunity to go through and play through them in order and see the connections between each game, you can really get a much better appreciation for Baldur's Gate 3, because there's a lot that's in there that's not obviously a callback when you first play it. But if you've played Baldur's Gate 1 or 2 dozens of times like the two of us have, you'll catch it. You'll appreciate it. There's plenty.
Yeah, and that's what necessitated me having to make, it wasn't an option. I had to make a Viconia video. It was unacceptable for me to leave it the way Larian left it. And I'm not saying anything bad about Larian at all. The fact that they included her, game of the year for me. I didn't care about the rest. But then when I actually got into the story and stuff, I said, look, I think we misunderstand who Viconia is. And I had to be very clear about that. I was not livid. I was just disappointed. But here's the thing. I don't care about how she looks, because that was done wrong. I get that. That was the overwhelming comment I got on my video. Like, no, you're right. The way they made her look was just it was I don't care. Her personality and everything that she is, there's a reason for it. And I know where Larian was going with that, but they did not explain that. And they could have had her a little bit more fleshed out by that point.
Yeah.
But they wanted to have this big reveal. But who are you revealing this to? Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 lovers. Who is not the majority of people who played the game.
probably know a lot more about Viconia than you're giving them in that
So
moment.
it didn't hit for them, and it didn't hit for the new players. So you totally whiffed.
Yeah.
And that's why I had to make the video.
I will say that
So-
that reveal with Viconia was one of the few disappointments I had with Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah. So anyway, we're not talking about, we're just saying how the relevancy between Baldur's Gate 1 and 3 is. We're not saying this is about all about Baldur's Gate
Just
3.
to be clear,
but,
I still love Baldur's Gate 3. I've done multiple honor mode playthroughs at this point because I enjoy that game. And I typically don't go for like the challenge run of games. So for Baldur's Gate 3, it's very much more that honor mode just kind of opens new gameplay experiences. So adding a little bit more in terms of the combat adds to that replayability for me, where I'm not just getting a different version of the story, I'm also kind of experiencing new challenges in the combat. And that's why I can go back to that game and replay it on honor mode, which normally I wouldn't, because I'm just not that good at video games.
No, you're real good. You don't give yourself enough credit. But Baldur's Gate 3, you know, the companions in that are well beloved, and for rightly so. I even like Will. A lot of people, I don't know, they don't. I like Will, but
Will, I feel like Will is plain in a game where no one else is plain, and that's kind of why Will stands out as like a bit of a disappointment for most of the audience. But Will's story is very familiar. I have some issues about the specific details about it. But it's very much like a fantasy hero story. It fits the game very well. It's just not as interesting as Karlach or Shadowheart's story.
meanwhile, you have Baldur's Gate 1, who suffers. This is where they suffer, and it helps them. And I'll explain that in just a minute. They suffer from too many companions.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't get to flesh them out. So you don't really, you do their one quest, maybe, and they're hanging out with you, and you get to level them up. Maybe they help your party, maybe they don't. Okay, but that's the extent of it. But here's the thing. They kind of help you in this regard. We're talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We're talking about Faerun. There are heroes everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There are adventurers everywhere. So you're going to run into them. And that's the part that makes it more immersive. So it suffers from there's too many of them, so you can't flesh them all out. They can't all be Minscs. They can't all be Jaheiras. Right. You know, they can't all be Imoens. And so you kind of are going to be limited into what you could do. But it lends itself to the immersion because you are going to be running into these people. You are going to be running into Baldur.
The fact that these people exist and you don't know anything about them, equally immersive. They don't know you. You don't know them. Why would you?
Right. And they also have their own mission.
Yep.
Not your mission.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that Baldur's Gate 3, and I don't think they did it poorly, but I think it's simple, and it didn't need to be simple. All of your companions in Baldur's Gate 3, with a couple of exceptions, have the same goal. What is going on with this tadpole? How do I help myself deal with this situation? That is very much not the case in Baldur's Gate 1 or 2. Everybody has their own agenda. Everybody has their own goal. And they work with you, and they provide some dialogue that explains, like, our goals either align to the point where I'm willing to work with you and help you as long as we deal with what I'm working on as well, or I need you to commit to dealing with this thing, and then in response, I will work with you even though I don't really care about what you're doing.
Yeah. And that also allows you some versatility too, unexpectedly. So if you have a will, and even if you can change his class and everything else, at the end of the day, you are limited for how many of these people you have. Well, in Baldur's Gate 1, you could get somebody like Kagan, who's a lawful evil dwarf. Very angry little dwarf. And he's pretty neat. I like him. But he is lawful evil. Well, maybe that's why I like him. I don't know. He's a great guy.
That tracks.
Suddenly, it's all making sense. But anyway, you get him, and he's got a little quest that you can do fairly easily. He's got a shop. I mean, so he's selling stuff that you need, so it's a win-win. And then he can accompany you, and he's a great fighter. He's amazing. He's got a ton of constitution. And anyway, my point here is that if you're a good aligned party player, he's not going to work with you for very long. Mm-hmm. There's your immersion. He is true to form. He will not hang around. But you can get far enough with him that in the second act, that basically can replace him for a good party. Mm-hmm. And he'll leave at that point. He's like, I don't need you, goody two shoes, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it works because you broke him out of prison, whatever, where he's at. And it's early enough that you can kind of make those adjustments. So again, Baldur's Gate 1 suffers because there's too many companions, but it also helps it because it lets you kind of mix and match what you need, and you get to kind of feel out what kind of player you are. That's great.
Yeah, I love that you can build a complex party in BG1 with people of different alignments, and they will still find a way to work together. You can recruit Edwin, and you can recruit Alora, and they somehow become really good friends, despite the fact that Alora is good aligned and Edwin is evil.
Yeah, but not Dynaheir. Can't bring Dynaheir along.
Well, yeah, no. That one's not going to work out. Less so because of the alignment and more because of very personal issues.
Right. But it's consistent with a story. A story within a story.
And that's helps the immersion so much. That is true to reality. You're going to find people that you disagree with on some very fundamental things. Doesn't mean you can't work together on something else. And it is going to be a bit of a challenge to try and govern those personalities as they conflict while you're trying to get things done, which was a big part of BG1 is, do I just want to find everybody who's good aligned so I don't need to worry about managing my squad? Or do I want to try and be the arbiter between people who disagree on the direction the party should take?
If BioWare in 1998 was writing Baldur's Gate 3, when you come up on Shadowheart after finding Lae'zel, they would give you a choice. Who's coming with you? Not both. Which one?
Yep.
That's how the dividing line is, and that's the difference in storytelling. It's a harsh line in the sand, and you have to make those decisions constantly in Baldur's Gate 1, which again adds a little bit more to the immersion. You don't get to always, we're going to be forced to be friends. We're going to have to work together. Sometimes people don't want to work with you, no matter what. Even if death is staring them right in the face, they will not work with you, and that is a Gith. That's how a Gith would actually respond.
Yeah, I think Baldur's Gate 3 gets praise and criticism in this regard, in that they abandoned that alignment system. Which, to be fair, BioWare didn't take too strictly. They did a great job with it as well, but Larian completely abandoned it. And you basically have to learn about your companions to figure out what their priorities are and evaluate how they're going to respond to your decisions, which is very much more realistic than Baldur's Gate 1. Whereas in Baldur's Gate 1, you can look at a character's alignment and say, oh, they're evil. They're probably not going to like it if I help this person or give them like a little bit of money or whatever. And that's absolutely true. But in Baldur's Gate 1, you have over a dozen available companions. I don't want to invest the time to learn the intricacies of their personality so that I can evaluate how they're going to fit on the team. I just want to know.
Yeah, and there's so many great characters, if you don't play Baldur's Gate 1 or 2, that are referenced in Baldur's Gate 3, that you'll have no idea what they're talking about. Valdorn's in 1 and 2. 1, she's a great druid. I usually take her to endgame. She's amazing.
She's the best druid.
Yeah. You'd think Jaheira, but Jaheira is really a half druid. I mean, she's half warrior, half druid.
Yeah.
So
People who only know Jaheira through Baldur's Gate 3 will not know that in 1 and 2 she was multi-classed fighter druid. And with the level cap system in BG1 and BG2, that was tremendously limiting as far as getting access to high-level druid spells. Faldorn is the only companion that has access to the highest tier of druid spells. That's why she's the best druid. Yeah.
In Baldur's Gate 1, near the end, you tend to run across some spellcasters that become a pain. So you think about like a group of archers. Like get the example of like 10 archers in a room. Let's say you have 5 wizards in a room and they're all casting fireball. Well, that is a cast. That takes time. Faldorn can send her summon insects, and so she casts the insects, and what does it do? By the description, you wouldn't think it does much, right? It just causes them to itch, and so it makes them whatever. But it does a little bit of damage, and it's not the damage you need, but it interrupts their spell casting, and now they can't cast. You have a whole room of wizards that can't cast. It's taken a little bit of damage, but now you can just waylay them on. It's just,
and that is the big thing that I remember from BG1 as far as the difficulty goes. If you can stop a mage from casting in that game, the fight just got so much easier. But if they have free reign to cast whatever spells they want, you're probably going to lose that fight.
Yeah. And that's why I've said before, like, if you're going to take Imoen, make her a mage. Just do it as soon as you can. Because if you're going to have to bring her, if you want to do it, like, say, for a lore immersion, I mean, I'm all for it. Do it that way. A lot of people don't take her at all. They just leave her. Which I totally get.
She's an okay thief. She's not the best thief in the game.
Right.
She's an okay mage when you dual class her. Just not the best mage in the game. A lot of the reason that I ended up taking Imoen with me is because she's familiar. You grew up together. It's a lore reason. It's not a gameplay reason.
And it would have been so much nicer to have some kind of reference to her in Baldur's Gate 3, because she's so integral to 1 and 2. I mean, massively integral. Yeah, well, not so much 1, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah. 1 only because obviously that's your introduction to her, and that's how she becomes relevant in 2. But yeah.
Without her,
anyway,
you're alone in the wilderness in BG1 at first. So
I mean, spoiler territory here, but I mean, I'm going to try to choose my words carefully, but without Imoen, we can't even ascend to godhood.
Yeah, that's that's true. But I just mean from a gameplay point of view, after you leave Candlekeep, you're alone. And then Imoen shows up and she's like, it's not as bad because now there's 2 of us.
So, and then there's other characters that are just minor characters, but it's interesting how BioWare weaved in their storytelling, because this is clearly a sign of one story writer for that chain taking control of it and saying, look, this is relevant over here, and being keeping the continuity alive. So you have a thief that you find near the coastline in Baldur's Gate 1. And if you do their quest and do that other stuff with her, it's not always the best idea to take them. But if you do, you kind of actually have easy access in Act 3 when you're dealing with incarceration. And if she's in your party. If she's not in your party, then you got to deal with it the conventional ways. But it's really interesting that they add these one characters, a character that you may have just barely run into or maybe never even ran into, can make a difference in Act 3 as far as your ease of progressing in the game.
And it's not something that's presented to you for a long time.
Yeah.
Even if they're in the party the entire time. Because you can get them in Act 1. They'll not bring it up until Act 3.
And if Larian was writing that scene, it would be like, yeah, I might or may not have some friends or a family member that is in Baldur's Gate 3 and I'd like to see them again. And okay. Hello, how are you? No,
Yeah.
she's all about herself. She's trying to say, I need this, I need to go do that, blah, blah, blah. She's all about herself. She's very self-centered.
Mm-hmm.
But I like her. So
Of course you do.
she's
What
not
was her
hiding
alignment again?
that. But anyway, she's a thief, so you can't be, too
You can't be
choosy.
lawful good. You
Yeah.
can be good.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's so many little details we could go over. And I really didn't think we would spend more than 30 minutes without comm. I feel bad.
Well, we were talking about one of our favorite game series. We could ramble about this for
This is my
ages.
favorite game series easily. Number one. I say Mass Effect, but in my heart, it's Baldur's Gate.
Mm-hmm. I loved 1 and 2 so much that I was nervous when 3 was announced, because I'm a pessimist, and I thought like, oh, they're gonna ruin a series for me. I'm so happy that they didn't. I'm tremendously happy with what BG3 is, and I do genuinely think that BG3 elevated this to where Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were definitely one of my top series. Baldur's Gate overall might be vying for that top spot at this point. It's just so well done. Just a wonderful experience across all 3 games.
And maybe we'll do one day a live stream where me and you chat about what really is a canon ending maybe for Baldur's Gate 3, because I have my strong opinions on that.
I do need to play through Act 3 a lot more. I've mastered Act 1 of Baldur's Gate 3. I
Yeah.
do need to do a lot more exploration in the city of Baldur's Gate, though.
I'm very open-minded. Like when they said Baldur's Gate 3 was coming out, I wasn't like, oh, cringe. Trust me, I'm so open-minded when it comes to that stuff. But I wasn't so much worried as I was like, why? Why do we need a Baldur's Gate? Because I know how 1 and 2 end.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't imagine a scenario where we needed a Baldur's Gate 3. And after playing the early access, like I said, from day 1, I said, what if they just called this whatever they wanted to, and since that called it a Baldur's Gate tale, I would have been fine with that. Now, having played through it, I totally see the connections. And if you're going to make that connection, make that connection. And that's why I think that there's an actual canon ending to Baldur's Gate 3. But that's just me. Maybe we'll do that sometime. It's interesting how Larian did show a lot of respect to the original one, Baldur's Gate 1, because there's a lot of little elements in it that pay homage to it that you wouldn't know unless you've played the game. So in Act 1, you start off in a central location and you're kind of thrust into the wilderness. And in Act 2, you're more or less diving through even deeper into that wilderness, so you on the surface you're on the wilderness, right? But on Act 2 it's more like you're deeper, darker into like the wilderness there, whereas like in Act 2 of Baldur's Gate 3 is very similar to kind of the feelings that you get in some of the places of Baldur's Gate 1, Act 2. And then Baldur's Gate 3 and Baldur's Gate 1, Act 3 is in Baldur's Gate. So it's almost like they're trying to keep the story going in the same direction, true to form to the original one, which I can appreciate, because in Baldur's Gate 2, you're not in Baldur's Gate at all.
Yeah.
Ever. So it's kind of funny.
I think those parallels between 1 and 3 in terms of just the kind of environment that you're in are so... There's such a lovely touch. It's such a nice callback to say, like, yeah, you have your character who's been kind of forcefully removed from what is familiar to them and thrown into this wilderness. And that wilderness is initially not terrible. It's not as terrifying as it could be. And there are little communities in pockets around the wilderness where you feel almost like this is a safe space. That was true in both games. And then you start digging into your own story and figuring out what the next steps are for you. Things start to get dark, and you start to just really dig into stuff and find yourself in much more terrifying environments, much more intimidating foes. And then it all culminates in you arriving at Baldur's Gate, and you have a conspiracy to shut down. It's such a nice homage to Baldur's Gate 1 to kind of parallel that story without just rehashing the story of Baldur's Gate 1. I think Larian did such a great job there of this very gentle reminder of where you came from.
Roots, right.
Yeah.
Because Baldur's Gate 1, when you go to Baragost, I could say that's very similar to the feeling that you get when you're in the Druid Grove.
Mm-hmm.
It's a place you constantly come back to. You get your equipment from, you have a safe vendor there. You have some lore you can pick up. You can pick up our dwarf buddy. When you're talking about Act 2, you go to the northern part of the map. So totally different. So yes, you can come back to Baragos, but there's really no reason to at that point. And then, of course, like we mentioned before, you go to Baldur's Gate 3, Baldur's Gate City and Baldur's Gate 3 and 1 and 3, I should say. Anyway, but there's all these like little things in between, of course. But that's, like I said, yeah, they definitely are there's a lot of these throwbacks, and like Jaheira is a great example of that too. Jaheira is consistent in her storytelling. Can you imagine in Baldur's Gate 3 if she was married to just anybody else? It'd be weird.
Yeah. I mean, you probably won't get into that as much until Baldur's Gate 2. They're like really digging into why Jaheira is the way that she is. And I mean, we've talked about that before off the podcast, but Jaheira has a ton of development in Baldur's Gate 2, just an absolute ton. And it's not overtly discussed in Baldur's Gate 3, but it's there. It's reflected in who she is in Baldur's Gate 3. And there are clever little callbacks where she talks about previous experiences and the events of the previous game. And it's just kind of mentioned in passing because you're not the same hero from those games. You wouldn't know what she's talking about. But I think, yeah, Jaheira is another great like tie back to the original series. And I think when Baldur's Gate 3 was first announced, we knew there were going to be those things. Jaheira made the most sense as far as a way to tie it back to the first two. The other ways that they've done it, I think I was less expecting, and I'm very happy with the way they've done it, with the exception of Viconia. I love that she was in the game. I'm not a huge fan of how she was in the game.
Viconia might be one of my most favorite characters in any video game. So it's really hard. I don't want to talk about Viconia because if you get me started, this is going to be another hour episode. So yeah, I really love Viconia. You find her in the woods, kind of just to the northeast of the Friendly Arms. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you know where she's at, you can kind of go there right away. But normally I would say if you're following the progression of the story, you won't really run into her until you get to Act 2. Mm-hmm. Because the woods of Pelville are in that northern section. But of course, I'm immediately going there because it's fairly easy to find her and not run into any other enemies. So if you know what you're doing. And she is by far the best cleric in the game. Hands down. There's no other. But she's so consistent to her character. And that's what I love about her. I've said this before. I love people who are true to themselves. Good or bad. they
mostly bad.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but she holds true to her own character and she owns that. And you know, she could deceive you, and she does try on occasion, but not in a manipulative way to where she's trying to she's almost trying to force you out of her world so that way she can protect you. And that's why I've said she's never been like a evil person the way they portrayed her in 3. Because she's never had that personality. In fact, the reason why she got kicked out of the Underdark was because she had that moment. She didn't want to kill a child. The other family members picked up on that and they tried to take her out. And then when Loth realized that she didn't have 100% complicity, She wanted to take out the entire house. So that's why when you talk about Viconia, her last name, her house is no longer there. So they were destroyed. But she lived. And so that's why I said she's never really been portrayed the way probably she should have been. But again, I could go on and on and on.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 that bothered me about Viconia. The character she is, the personality she demonstrates across those two games, never seemed consistent with that alignment. And it's very much what you're talking about, that Viconia was raised in a society that we would consider evil aligned. And she did what she had to fit in that society. And when it was clear that she didn't fit in every way, she was outcast. So she still has those lingering kind of conditions, those things that have been instilled into her from growing up in that society. And she still has a lot of that disrespect for surfacers that comes from that society. And all of those things come through in her character. But the core evilness, what we would think of as evilness, it's not really there. There are flashes of selfishness. There are things along those lines where, she's willing to go to extremes for certain things. But she never felt like a truly evil character to me. And then in is it Shadows of Am, you can work with her, and she ends up adopting a new alignment, which was very much not a thing prior to that. Like that was not a thing with any other characters in BG1 Siege of Dragonspear or BG2. It was only introduced in Shadows of Am. And I think there's only 2 characters that can change their alignment. And she's one of them. And the other character is not as memorable, so who knows?
Yeah, the Drow do not like any other race, really. They always think that they're higher than everybody. But more than any other race, they hate surface elves. They just more than any, you name me the race, they don't hate them nearly as much as surface elves. So when you have Jaheira in your party, again, if BioWare is staying true to form, it's either Jaheira or the Drow. But they write it to where Viconia is not really a traditional Drow. And that's what I like about it, is that they took that and they said, yes, we know this is what should happen. So in the example of Lae'zel or Shadowheart, that's how BioWare would write that scene. However, in this scene, the reason why it works is because there's a very specific personality that Viconia brings to the table that makes that work. And that's not done to Lae'zel, in my opinion. As much as I like Lae'zel, it's not done in that way.
I feel like Lae'zel is not introduced in that way. I feel like that transition does happen for her if you as the player guide her through that. But it's not there immediately, and you're not presented with that reformed Lae'zel instantly and then grow to discover why it is she's different, which is definitely the experience you get with Viconia. You get very much this is a Drow, let's make a bunch of assumptions, and then you spend time with her and you realize a lot of those assumptions are inaccurate.
And I guess what I'm trying to say, in a nutshell, all these characters are very complex. And even though they don't have nearly as many voice lines as they do in Baldur's Gate 3, it translates. It tracks, and they're consistent with it. Imoen is always Imoen. Viconia is always Viconia. Jaheira is always Jaheira. And there's no gray area there. You know this. Minsc is always Minsc. Edwin is always Edwin.
Even when Edwin's Edwina, he's still...
Yeah. That's another, BioWare's always had the whole open-mindedness of transgender in their hearts. They turned Edwin into Edwina.
I mean, Edwin didn't have that same open-mindedness, but
right.
BioWare did.
Yeah. Hey, it's Faerun. It is what it is.
I think that would have been really difficult. We've talked about the number of companions counts against BG1 and also counts in its favor. I think that's true of BG3 as well. I feel like if you tried to keep that level of complexity in BG3 with everyone being fully voice acted, it would become a bear. That's a tremendous amount of effort to develop them. It's tough to make that call, particularly with BioWare, where they seem to put in the groundwork to make an incredible series, and then it works out. But you couldn't know what it was going to turn into at the time. And I don't know if this is the way they do things at BioWare or the way they have done things. But it does feel like every time they release a story that's multiple installments, it feels like they've thought it all through from the beginning. They have a story in mind for the sequel that continues everything before they're even guaranteed a sequel, which from an artist point of view, awesome. That's such a great way to go about things. From a business point of view, probably a little tougher to justify. But I mean, based on our red flags episode, I don't really care about the business side of things. I care about the art side of things.
Yeah, because it's very difficult to create a movie or a TV show with all this, lore going from before into one game. Where a lot of them make a mistake is they try to tell you too much too soon to kind of catch you up. Just tell the story.
Yeah.
If your story is good enough to hold on its own, just tell the story, and then we'll come along for the ride. We'll find out about the lore from way back when.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we talked about that in our lore episode, to say that, like, there's a lot of information, and the way you're presented with that information immediately really dictates how you're going to feel about the game. If you just lecture me about the world that this game is set in, I'm not going to be engaged. I'm not going to want to explore. I'm going to feel like I'm sitting in a lecture hall and I should be taking notes because there's going to be a quiz later. That's not what I want from a video game, and BioWare has never done that. Baldur's Gate 1, you're just thrown into the world, and you have your ability to learn the lore on your own. Mass Effect, there's a bit of, lore dumping in small, discrete
at the beginning
moments.
Yeah.
There where you can you can talk to Presley and get his whole backstory, and then you don't talk to Presley for a while. You can talk to Avina at the Citadel. You can learn everything about what she's standing next to. And you don't need to do that, but it's there, and it helps build the world out. It's really just a great way to say that, like, we've thought of all of this. We're not going to brag about the fact that we've addressed it already. It feels very much like we're going to do this the right way by presenting it to you as if you exist in this world. And this is all stuff that you either already know, or if you're curious about it, you'll go figure it out on your own.
Yeah, which is a very organic way of learning.
And I think Baldur's Gate and Mass Effect, obviously, but they both set this up in a way that the narrative makes sense for the player's ignorance. So in Baldur's Gate, you grew up in Candlekeep. You're sheltered. You're not going to know the way that things work on the outside beyond a student, which is not really an accurate representation of the real world for a lot of people. You're going to learn more about it by going out and experiencing the world than you are in your sheltered little environment studying. Same with Mass Effect. You are an Alliance soldier. You're not exploring on your own before you know Shepard. Shepard is an Alliance soldier. He knows the Alliance very well. And you as the player are okay to say, like, oh, I know space military. Yeah, that's familiar enough. I don't need to dig into that. It's all of the stuff that doesn't exist in the real world that I don't know anything about. And the fact that there's a narrative explanation of why the character you're controlling would be asking those questions really, really helps that immersion.
Yeah, and in Candlekeep, they tell you at the beginning that it is a location of arcane steady, and the only way to enter is to bring in a tome that they don't have. They tell you this, but it's kind of like passing information. We'll find out that's important information later on, but they didn't hit you over the head with that. But it's there. And that's what I'm talking about. It's like whether it sinks in or not, it's not relevant, but they will make sure that when you get to that point, that is consistent with what they told you to begin with. When they talk about places like Waterdeep, or other exotic places, they don't really hit you over the head with it because you're never going to go there, but you do get a consistent impression of the people that are from there and how they describe it. But again, it's not one of those things that it is part of your world, so it's important to know it, but it's not so important that it's going to affect your gameplay or your character or anything like that, or any of your companions. But they do present it in a way that helps lay down the foundation of the world where you're at.
Yeah. I think they do a very effective job of mimicking reality in the sense that the more information impacts your situation, the more of that information you're going to have. So you don't know much about Waterdeep. You can look up some information about it if you're curious, but you're not really going to get a tremendous amount of information on that unless you're going looking in a lot of weird places that the story doesn't take you. You're not really going to learn too much about Thay beyond Edwin's point of view on it, or Dynahair's point of view on it, or Nira's with the enhanced edition. You're going to learn about Baldur's Gate because that's relevant. And that's a very real thing. I don't know a lot of things that don't affect me because they don't affect me. But if they're relevant to what's going on, I'm going to seek out that information.
One thing I haven't ever researched, and it just came to my mind just now, and I really shouldn't even bring it up. But Baldur's Gate 2, you have the Underdark, and the weapons you find there in the armor is superior to anything you're going to find most of the time. But yet it turns to dust when you come into the sunlight. Mm-hmm. None of that happens. None of that's even referenced in Baldur's Gate 3. So I don't know if the lore has changed for that type of thing.
Well, I think, if I remember, it's Drow adamantium. It's the material that you use in the Grimforge in Baldur's Gate 3. And I think the fact that the Grimforge is disconnected from the rest of the area, like you have to go out of your way to get there and solve a little puzzle to use the Grimforge, kind of represents the only way of getting that adamantium gear forged in such a way that it can exist in sunlight. So maybe it's lore consistent. It would be something to look into.
It would have been neat to like come out of the Underdark and suddenly you're naked.
I mean, that does kind of seem to be what a lot of people wanted from Baldur's Gate 3.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it would have been a neat little throwback to the original series,
Yeah, I would have, and I think there's definitely a way to go about doing that, to like, you still have those items that you can forge at the Grimforge, but to have like lesser versions of those items scattered around the Underdark, and as you collect them, you can use them in your equipment, and then when you get out of the Underdark, they disintegrate. That would have been a great connecting through line for me.
They have crates of things. What if one of the crates you find is drow armor in it? You're like, oh, here's a find. Put it on. You use it throughout the entire time you're down there. You're kicking butt. Then you come out, you ain't got no armor no more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. That would have been a great connection to the lore of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, to say that, yeah, the gear that you knew from those early games that still exists. Maybe it's less prevalent because 100 years have passed or whatever, but it's still scattered around the Underdark. You can find it.
Yeah. I don't know. That was just me. And like I said, that's more of a Baldur's Gate 2 discussion, but
yeah.
One of those things, like I said, if we're going to keep tying the relevancy of Baldur's Gate 3 to the original series, that just kind of came to my head. I don't know. Thought about it. Anyway, I really think I could go another 2-3 hours, but we have things to do, and we can always circle around to this again.
Kiki needs attention.
Yeah. Next time we have an XCOM, we'll just continue.
Yeah.
An XCOM
that sounds
session.
good to me.
Com loves the series XCOM. That's why we're like picking on him for the XCOM reference.
Kind of showcased that Baldur's Gate 1 was, for a lot of people, the example of what could be done at that time. It was a game that really did everything it set out to do very well, and kind of showcased what RPGs could be at that time, which, like you're saying, that there wasn't another example of an RPG that hit all the boxes, that covered everything an RPG should be. Baldur's Gate stood out in that regard.
Well, I guess we'll call it right there for now. I'm pretty sure we'll come back to this. And,
I have plenty more to say.
Yeah. It was kind of like an on-the-fly type thing for me and Banana, too. So, anyway, if you enjoyed the episode, give it a like, subscribe. Don't forget to give it a comment. Comments go a long way in YouTube. We are on Spotify. We are on Apple Podcasts and Amazon. And what do you think about that, Com? Oh, I love this episode. It was really good. Thank you for having me today.
Com says join the Discord.
Oh, join the Discord. Well, thank you, Com. I appreciate that. All right, well, we'll check you guys later. Bye-bye.